Hi guys, so I wanted to give you an introduction to the United States Constitution and how we get there. So after the United States wins their independence from Great Britain, they are concerned about having a central or federal government that's too powerful, so they create the Articles of Confederation, which is just like a loose organization of the states. There's no national currency, there's no regulation of trade between the states, there's no power to tax. If they want to approve laws, 9 out of the 13 states had to approve those laws. There's no national court. Congress is responsible to the states. There's no stand-in army, and the national government essentially has very little to no power. This becomes really ineffective. Imagine every time you went to New Jersey or Connecticut, you had to exchange money because you couldn't use your New York currency in either of those states. Very problematic. The federal government also had war debts now, and they couldn't tax to pay. So if they needed money, they had to be like, hey, states, could you give us money? And much like my parents when I was a teenager, the states would say no. Some of the achievements, though, of the Articles of Confederation were that they could make treaties and declare war. They were able to negotiate the Treaty of Paris, which will end the war and settles the U.S. border now at the Mississippi River. They're able to pass the Land Ordinance of 1785, which set rules for how new states would join the Confederation. And they passed the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. All this, though, even though we've increased the size of our nation, we've gained independence and all these wonderful things, there's a lot of problems. There's no executive branch. There's no judicial branch. There's only Congress, and they have very little power. So to address this, they hold a constitutional convention, and they decide that they have to amend the Articles of Confederation. By amending the Articles of Confederation, they can address those problems. Well, ultimately, they decide we're just going to create a new government without the weaknesses of the Articles while avoiding a national government that's so strong it will threaten the liberties of its citizens. Because they remember what it was like to be under a tyrannical king, and they didn't want that. So at the convention, George Washington will preside over it. James Madison will be one of the main authors. Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, these guys are all there. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams are being diplomatic representatives in Europe and are not there. And Patrick Henry refuses. He's like, you're going to create a strong government. I want no part of this. Which to me seems like, well, if you were there, maybe you could have prevented some of that. I don't know. But also, there are no women. There are no indigenous people. There are no Black Americans. It is just essentially the colonial elite who are now the national elite who will oversee this. So what we see at the Constitution is there's a lot of compromise and a lot of arguments. So Federalists, such as Alexander Hamilton, want a very strong national government which will provide order and protect the rights of the citizens. When they start to discuss whether or not they need a Bill of Rights to ensure the freedoms of Americans, they argued that the bill was unnecessary because if a power wasn't given in the Constitution, it didn't exist, and thus you didn't need it. Anti-federalists such as Jefferson are going to argue that they want a weak national government so it wouldn't threaten the rights of the people or the powers of the state. They want a Bill of Rights that will spell out the rights of the people to protect them from abuses of power. What we end up seeing is the Constitution will be created with restrictions of power. It becomes known as a federalist system where there's not one sovereign centralized power with all the authority. So what that means is the national government doesn't have all the power. It is divided between the federal and state and local governments. So this is cooperative federalism. We have overlap in powers between the national government and the state government. States get to keep some power, but they also have to give up some of the power to the national government. In the end, when the Constitution is formed, it starts with we the people because they really believe the power of the government comes from the consent of the governed. So they push this idea of popular sovereignty, this idea that the source of the power of the government is the people, and they create this representative democracy. So in this federal system, we have separation of powers between state, local, national governments. We have delegated powers. So these are powers only for the federal government, such as declaring war, regulating trade between states, coin and money. Now we just have the US currency, maintaining an army and navy. And then they also have this law that says they can make all laws necessary to carry out the delegated powers. So one of the things that's nice about our Constitution is it's flexible. It's allowed to change over time, and we do that through how we interpret the Constitution and also amending the Constitution. So the elastic clause, it makes it stretchy, also known as the necessary and proper clause, allows Congress to make all laws necessary and proper to ensure the welfare of the people. There's implied powers. These are powers given to the government by the elastic clause. So for example, when FEMA was created to deal with natural disasters or even unemployment insurance to help with people losing their jobs, this is done through the elastic clause. We can also amend the Constitution. So when we talk about the Bill of Rights, that's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution to adjust it. And that's a process, is a little bit harder than just passing a law by Congress. But then it also, the elastic clause has been interpreted in different ways. The Constitution has been interpreted in different ways. And that's the loose interpretation or loose construction versus the strict construction. So people who loosely interpret the elastic clause and the Constitution really believe that the powers of the Constitution can kind of be stretched. It's a little flexible to do what's necessary within the confines or other restrictions. Whereas people who are strict constitutionalists, they believe that the Constitution must be followed exactly as it was written. There's no like reading between the lines or being flexible. So Bill Clinton, George Washington, they understood this idea of loose construction, really kind of being flexible with how you interpret what's being said. Whereas Jefferson, George Bush, they're like, if it doesn't say it in the Constitution, you really shouldn't do it. Of course, they don't always follow their own advice, and that's a lesson for a different day. Concurrent powers are powers shared by the state and national government. So enforcing laws. We have state laws, we have federal laws, right? Collecting taxes. If you haven't figured it out yet, you'll figure it out eventually. State taxes, local taxes, federal taxes, tons of taxes. They establish courts, right? So we have the Supreme Court, but we also have local and state courts. They can build roads like federal highways versus state highways. They can borrow money, and they can protect the safety of the people. So we have like the National Guard and military, but there's also the state police and local police as well. Now, reserved powers are constitutional powers that only belong to the states. They can conduct elections, they can establish schools, they can regulate marriage, they establish local governments, they regulate business, they license professionals. Like there's so many things that belong to the states, and it's been controversial because over the years the federal government has increased their powers in various areas and have passed legislation that might conflict with this idea of reserved powers and then leads to debate. For example, No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top are federal educational guidelines. And then a lot of states' rights proponents have questioned whether or not that violates the reserved powers, or even the regulation of marriage at the federal level has been questioned. So these are, I'm gonna put this up really quick. So federalism, again, so you have delegated powers, concurrent powers, and reserved. So there's powers for the government, national government, there's powers shared, and then there's powers only for the state governments. And the sharing of these powers between the state and national governments is federalism. Now, there are denied powers. So these are things that in the Constitution that no government in this nation are supposed to do. So they're not supposed to take the right of habeas corpus, which essentially would give you a right to a speedy trial. And again, not always the case. That's a lesson for another time. They cannot make a law ex post facto, so that means they can't make an act a crime if it was committed before the law was passed. So if you commit an act and then the government makes it illegal, they can't go back and arrest you for it. It would only have to be if you did it again after they made the law. And unfortunately, I will never be a true princess or lady or lord because we have no titles of nobility. We do have a system of checks and balances. So we have the three branches, right? Legislative is in charge of passing laws, the executive is in charge of enforcing them, and judicial will go ahead and review those laws and determine if they're constitutional or not. And when their powers combine, they're able to essentially kind of keep a check on each other to make sure that one branch isn't more powerful than the other. And there's been debates and arguments throughout history as to whether or not there's been points where the executive branch has been too powerful or the legislative branch has been too powerful. And we'll look at that more as we go throughout the year. Now, there's a lot of things in this presentation I'm not going to talk about, but you can go ahead and look at them. Keep in mind that there's a lot of compromises that will go into essentially creating the Constitution. And that is a story for another time.